Moana Mackie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's been an extraordinary year for legislation in the House. Just when you think it can't get any worse, just when you think you've hit a real legislative low, along comes Dr Nick Smith with his spade and digs even deeper, because this is just about one of the worst pieces of legislation I think we've had before the House. And I say to Jamie Lee Ross, clearly he wasn't on the Select Committee, because if he was, he would know that, in fact, the submissions that we received in favour of the bill were about as apathetic and lukewarm as you could possibly get. Because, yes, they liked what Dr Smith said the bill was going to do, but when they were actually pressed by members of the committee to show how it would achieve the claimed outcomes, they all had to admit that, in fact, they had no guarantees of that. I don't think I've ever seen some of these groups as underwhelmed about a piece of legislation that they support as they were about the Local Government Amendment Bill, because this will do nothing about rates increases. Absolutely nothing. So the great claims that it's somehow going to reduce rates and make it more affordable are a load of codswallop, and Dr Smith knows that. There is no mechanism in this bill to reduce rates, and there is nothing in this bill which is going to result in a reduction of costs to council. And let's be clear, where have the increased costs on councils come from that have been passed on to ratepayers? Infrastructure. Infrastructure and requirements put on them by central government to meet new standards without the attached funding. So when you look at the infrastructure, as Mr Williams pointed out, John Key has been telling local government for years that they need to spend more on infrastructure, that their debt levels are so prudent that they're in the position that they can do that in a responsible manner, that our economic development as a country can't go forward if local government doesn't come to the party and increase their spending on infrastructure, that he wanted to partner with them to ensure that both central and local government were investing in this infrastructure. They went ahead, they did what the Prime Minister asked them to do. They did it in good faith. And then what happens? Nick Smith turns around and kicks them in the guts for doing exactly what the Prime Minister asked them to do, and uses it as a reason to pass a piece of legislation which will completely gut local government in New Zealand. Now, was John Key setting up local government? Was this all part of some big plan to set local government up so that they increased their debt because the government's asked them to spend more on infrastructure, so that Nick Smith could then swoop in and blame them for increasing their debt to pay for the infrastructure that John Key asked for? Or is this just complete ineptitude where one hand of government doesn't know what the other hand is doing? Well, I always favour cock-up over conspiracy, so I suspect that Nick Smith and John Key just didn't even talk about this. And while John Key was travelling around the country asking councils to be more responsible, to invest in infrastructure, Nick Smith was slowly crawling along behind him, wringing his hands in pleasure, thinking this is going to give me the reason I need to do what I've always wanted to do, which is to centralise power and control over local government in New Zealand. And it is a tragedy, because this bill removes the four well-beings. We heard from Jackie Dean, who said, oh, it doesn't matter because they can still do everything they already wanted to do under the new purpose clause. Well, then why remove the four well-beings? If the intent was not to limit what local government can do, then why did we have to remove the four well-beings? The fact is, Jackie Dean knows very well, Nick Smith knows very well, that this is all about telling councils what they can and can't do. This is all about restricting their activities, and Dr Smith is nodding. He might want to tell his colleague Jackie Dean, who said the exact opposite of that, because Dr Smith, as well as being the former Minister for Manufactured Crises, is also the former Minister for Manufactured Outrage. And so he stood up today and he gave a great speech on just how dreadful it is that local government have gone into all these areas that they shouldn't be going, and it's out of control. It's just crazy what they're doing. What a load of nonsense. As Nick Smith well knows, the figures that he used to justify this legislation were so shonky that the Department of Internal Affairs had to take them down off the website, but not before we managed to print off a copy of them to show just how shonky those figures are. He constantly refers to the one council that is having financial difficulties at the moment, and very serious financial difficulties, the Kaipara Council. 1 out of 78. 1 out of 78, and apparently we have to gut the entire system because one council at the moment is in trouble. It's no wonder that 100% of local authorities voted against this legislation. All oppose it, all say it won't work, all say it will do more damage than good. And all to apparently arrest rates increases, which this bill won't do. Won't do at all. unless the message government is now sending local government is stop investing in infrastructure, because we don't want you to do it. And let's just remember, this is at a time when the government is pulling back support for local government. They used to help out local, provincial councils with their local roads. Well, that funding's been cut. That funding's been cut right back. Where does Nick Smith think that those councils are going to get that money from? In order to bridge that gap where central government did partner with local government, they're going to have to turn to ratepayers. And then Nick Smith will blame local government for having to turn to ratepayers to bridge the gap in funding that his government has cut. Well, there's a word for that. And local government know very well the dangers of this piece of legislation, because nowhere is the impact of this going to be more serious than in provincial and rural New Zealand, where the councils rely on the flexibility of the four wellbeing so that they can determine for themselves what their priorities should be as a council, in consultation with their communities. It's not Nick Smith sitting in Wellington telling them what their priorities will be. It's those councils deciding for themselves. And so you look at the example of Ashburton Council, which is providing health services in Rakaia because the government's not doing that, and those communities wouldn't have access to those services without their council. You look at the running of festivals around the country for communities of interest. You look at the work Mayor Meng Foon in Gisborne has been doing, trying to support the Gisborne to Napier rail line. You look at Mayor John Forbes in Aportiki, who's been running an economic development strategy to get more aquaculture to provide hundreds and hundreds of jobs to employ the people of Aportiki. Todd McLeay should know, the Mayor of Kawerau is an absolute advocate for that community. And the work he's done leading a response to youth suicide in that community has been incredibly valuable in that community. You look at the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs, Malcolm Campbell. You look at the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs. Now, this is a scheme which has had far more success in addressing rising youth unemployment than anything this government has done in their 4 years. You look at the work that Dale Williams has been doing, the Mayor of Otrahonga, in running that. All these things that I've mentioned are now no longer going to be the mandate of local government. Well, actually, it should be up to local. They're democratically elected. They're democratically elected just like members of this House. It should be up to them to decide what's right for their communities, not for the national government and their support parties to dictate down from on high. And one of the most worrying parts of this legislation, and Canterbury members know this all too well, is when we have a reorganisation of local government at the moment, so where a council's being removed or amalgamated, currently all the communities involved have the right to a referendum. So if you're amalgamating 4 councils, they'll have a referendum in each of those councils. Now, if one of those councils votes against it, it doesn't go ahead. And what this means is that all that groundwork has to be done beforehand to address all the issues, all the concerns of the communities involved before it gets put to a referendum, because they know that if there's one district that feels as though their views and their priorities and their needs are going to be overlooked in a much larger council, then the whole thing could fall apart. And that's what happened in Dr Nick Smith's own area of Nelson Tasman. Well, now that's going. Now there is no longer an automatic right to a referendum. So we will see, or we could see, and I think we will see, the subsuming of the interests of smaller councils by much larger councils without that protection that was in law to ensure that no community, no matter how isolated they are, no matter how small they are, will have their needs overridden by the views of a much larger voting bloc somewhere else in their district. And you only have to look at Canterbury, where the Canterbury Regional Council is not democratically elected. My colleague Megan Woods, who represents the electorate of Wigram, tells me that her constituents would love to be allowed to have an election for their regional council next year. Please, sir, Dr Nick Smith, can we have an election like everyone else in the country is going to have? But what we're actually seeing in this legislation is, if you look at the Wellington region, what's clear is that Dr Nick Smith is setting this up so that he can defer the Wellington election next year. So you won't be alone, Canterbury, in not having an election, because I suspect Wellington will also not have elections. So the voters out there in Wellington at the moment could have, under this legislation, a power handed to the Honourable Dr Nick Smith when he takes his role back up as Minister of Local Government, where he could just say, you know what, be damned with democracy, you don't get to have your election because I'm on a tight time frame and you're actually interfering with it with all your needs for elections and elected members and such annoying things. So I'm going to defer your elections, and who knows when they'll get their election back. Who knows when they'll get their election back. This is not how local government needs to operate in New Zealand. And the worst aspect of all of this is there is no mischief that needs addressing here. local government ain't broke. Dr Smith's broken it now. It wasn't broken. It was working well. It was meeting the needs of all communities around New Zealand, not the ideological desires of one man, the Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Maggie Barry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, we on this side